Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today I'm very happy to welcome back to this program renowned economist Yanis Varoufakis for a conversation about the trade wars. Yanis Varoufakis is a former finance minister of Greece. He's leader of Mira 25 party and professor of economics at the University of Athens. He is the author of a number of books, including Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism. Yanis Varoufakis, thank you very much.
Always a pleasure, Mitch. Always.
I said there in the introduction, I called this a trade war. Do you think that's appropriate to look at what's happening right now with these tariffs, what's happening globally as a trade war?
Well, there's always an element of a trade war when you have tariffs being thrown around. But allow me to say that over the last 30, 40 years, I've come to recognize another nature hidden within every trade war, and that is a class war, a hidden class war wrapped up in a trade war. Because one of the great fallacies of our era, and when I say our era, I mean the last 200 years, is to imagine that this is, something like a war between the United States and China, between America and Europe, and so on. It never is. There is a much more interesting story to be told there along the lines of a class war. If you think of what happened ever since Richard Nixon blew up the Bretton Woods system in 1971, it's been a major class war by the ruling class of the United States against the American people. And elements of that, important elements of that, can be found in the Trump shock, which is a carbon copy, or attempts to be a carbon copy of what Nixon did. So that was a very long-winded answer to your simple question. It's always a class war at the bottom of it, and the tariff war is simply a pretext for a much more general and interesting shake-up of the international system in which money and goods circulate that the Trump administration is attempting.
So tell me more about that, how this is a class war, how you see this as a class war. And have trade wars always had elements of class war in them?
Always. Think of, the first post-war era, the so-called Bretton Woods era, which I mentioned before. Starts off with 1944 with the Bretton Woods Conference, which designed the post-war order of things, primarily a relationship between the United States, Europe, and Japan, other countries too, but these were the main players. The idea there was that after the Second World War, which left only the United States standing as a major economic power, as a creditor nation, a creditor economy, a surplus economy. The factories of Europe and Japan were either not producing or in smithereens. So the whole point there was how to make sure that American factories would continue to produce exports for the rest of the world, to maintain the surplus position of the United States, by dollarizing Europe and Japan, so that the Europeans and the Japanese could buy, so that the American factories could continue to produce the stuff that they were capable of producing after the massive boost in the productivity of American manufacturing during the war. And by the end of the 1960s, America had become a deficit country for a number of reasons, which you know very well. Vietnam, the Great Society, the fact that the German-Japanese factories that the American system was nurturing had become very productive. And Richard Nixon decided that enough is enough. The American working class would have to suffer. The American working class would have essentially to experience an epic reduction in its income, thus the class war aspect of it, so that the American ruling class could benefit from the profits of the Japanese, the Germans, and later the Chinese capitalists. Because if you think about it, from the 1970s onwards, while there has been this diminution, secular decline in real hourly wages in the United States, the American trade deficit that Trump is talking so much about, the American trade deficit expanded. Essentially, the trade account of the United States went deeper and deeper into the red. But that was part of the plan. And I can tell you who was behind that plan. I can put names and addresses to it. It's not a conspiracy, it's a plan. And the idea was that it would operate the trade deficit of the United States. It's like a huge vacuum cleaner. It would suck into the American territory the net exports of Germany, Japan, oil by the Saudi Arabians and so on, and of course later the Chinese. They would be paid by dollars that would be minted liberally. And those dollars, what would the foreigners do with the dollars? They would send it back to New York to recycle it in the form of American public debt, treasuries. So essentially, the foreign capitalists would fund the American state's deficit, the army of the United States, and so on. And the rest of the money would go into real estate in Manhattan, in Miami, in California, and some shares that Washington would allow foreigners to buy, not everything. So essentially, that was a class war waged against the American working class, on the one hand, but also the German working class. Because the German working class was suppressed, its wages were suppressed so that German goods could remain competitive in the United States under a depreciating dollar. The American working class was destroyed. There was carnage. Trump was right. You only have to go anywhere in the Midwest to see that. And the great beneficiaries of the world were the American rentier class, who were no longer producing stuff. They became financiers, they became real estate agents, or even companies like Apple. Essentially, were not producing anything in the United States. It was all produced elsewhere. The European and the Japanese working class did have the benefit of lots of manufacturing jobs, but very low wages, suppressed. Austerity played that role. So it's a clear class war. So American rentiers, German, Japanese, and later Chinese capitalists getting together against the working classes of America, Europe, and Asia. And, Trump is simply trying to revive that. Because this model, ever since the financial collapse of 2008, has been waning. And Trump wants to give it another boost, while in the meantime getting elected by the American working class, to whom it promises a return to the glory days of before 1971.
Now, I think the perception there is Trump is using tariffs in order to get us and try to get us back to this pre-1970 era when we were a surplus economy, when we were manufacturing goods, that these tariffs are meant to force corporations to bring their manufacturing base back here to the United States so that we could be where we were before Richard Nixon began this sort of whole endeavor.
Yes, but interestingly, what Trump is doing is very close to what Nixon did. Allow me to compare the three main elements of the Nixon shock or of the Trump shock. The first one is both of them want a massive devaluation of the dollar to make American exports more competitive and simultaneously make imports into the United States dearer. Okay, Nixon succeeded in doing that by decoupling the American dollar from all the other currencies around the world and from gold, and essentially engineering a massive depreciation of the US dollar. That's what Trump wants to do. If you read Stephen Millan's paper, the famous paper of the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors of the president, of the current president, you see it's in black and white. So that's the thing. The second component of the strategy is, while devaluing the dollar, to make it more dominant. This is the counterintuitive but potentially successful strategy. It was successful under Nixon. He did devalue the dollar substantially, and never before was the dollar as dominant as it was after it was devalued. Essentially, what you're doing is you're forcing foreigners who get their hands on lots of dollars to buy long-term American public debt. And that's what makes, essentially, every bank in the world, whether it's private or public, since Nixon's shock, depended on dollars as reserves. Once upon a time, they had gold.
It was gold. And Nixon separated the dollar from gold.
That's right. But so Nixon succeeded in dividing the dollar and making it the essential ingredient for the stability of the financial system of the world. That's the so-called reserve currency status of the dollar being preserved while it is divided. So these two are exactly the same principles guiding the strategy of Nixon and Trump. And then there's a third one, tariffs. Have we forgotten that on the 15th of August 1971, from Camp David, Richard Nixon, when he announced the blowing up of the Bretton Woods system, everything I've just been describing, one of the things he announced was a universal 10% tariff on all imports into the United States. Does this ring a bell? So, I am lest I am misunderstood, I am an ardent opponent of Donald Trump, but I can't stand looking and watching and hearing Democrats in the United States and centrists in Europe saying, "Oh, this is unprecedented. This has never happened before. Oh my goodness, what is he doing?" What do you mean what he's doing? He's doing what Nixon did, more or less, with very small variations. And all these lamentations by the radical center, the Bidenists and the, Kamala Harris supporters in the United States and the centrists in Europe, all these lamentations of this world of fantastic stability that we're now losing. Well, it is a world that came straight out of the cannon that Nixon shot. It's a world that was created by the Nixon shock, which is very similar to the Trump shock. So there's so much hypocrisy in the responses to what Trump is doing that it makes it hard for us to separate the signal from the noise.
I'm trying hard to understand what the logic of what Trump is doing here. And I don't say that dismissively of what he's doing here. Most of the coverage is that this is just nonsense that he's doing. It has been, and when I have found defenses for what Trump is doing, it's been kind of in technical language. I'm not an economist. And so I'm trying to find what the logic here is and what Trump is trying to achieve. And I guess and this is just me being stuck and having difficulty understanding these things generally anyways, but I'm trying to understand how it's a continuation from what Richard Nixon did. If what Richard Nixon did meant that we lost manufacturing jobs, is Trump not trying to bring manufacturing jobs back now?
He is. Look, allow me to try to shed some light into the logic. So, in 1970, a year before the Nixon shock, there was a gathering under Henry Kissinger. Remember, Kissinger back then was not in the State Department. He was at the NSC, the National Security Council, and typical Kissinger, all about geopolitics and geoeconomics and geostrategic thinking. His concern was really very simple. As a historian of power, Kissinger was very worried because he could see that the United States was falling from a surplus position into a deficit position. Okay, and every time that had happened before in human history, the hegemon who went from the surplus position to the deficit position lost its hegemony. So he asked a simple question of his team in that meeting, and he said, "Okay, folks, how do we preserve our hegemony?" Typical Kissinger question, right? And there was a young man as part of that team, Paul Volcker, the famous Paul Volcker. He became famous, something like 8 years later, 8 years later, because he became the chairman of the Fed.
When you say Volcker, I think of what automatically comes into my head is the Volcker shock.
Yeah, exactly. But that's part of the Nixon shock. And it's part of the strategy which he outlined to Kissinger in 1970. Because when Kissinger said, "Okay, now we have a deficit, what are we going to do with that?" And Paul Volcker said, "The one thing we must not do is be German." By that he meant we shouldn't impose austerity upon ourselves, tighten the belt to shrink the deficit. Because if we do that, then we will simply make a recession worse and we're going to lose our hegemony. We must expand our deficit, make it larger. And then, of course, the question is, who's going to pay for it? And Paul Volcker said very simply, the foreigners. So the American deficit sucked into the United States the exports of Germany, and the German capitalists returned the dollars that they were paid with, which was just IOUs, pieces of paper with, the greenback shape and form, going back to the United States, and plugging the holes of the emerging deficit. So the whole of what we call neoliberal era globalization is the acting out, the implementation of this Kissinger, Volcker, John Connolly, Richard Nixon plan. Okay? Now, that meant, however, that to keep this system stable, it had to get increasingly unbalanced. What do I mean by that? The American deficit, in order to keep the German factories, the Japanese factories, and later the Chinese factories churning stuff out, the American deficit had to keep growing as a percentage of American GDP. Right? So here comes the interesting logic of the Trump team. I'm not saying that it's the Donald's logic, but his team clearly have stated that. They say, okay, we've reached the point where, because of the deficit getting bigger and bigger since 1971, in order to stabilize the world and American hegemony, the American deficit has essentially caused American manufacture to shrink and shrink and shrink, because, we let other people produce the stuff and we bring them into the United States. So now we have a situation where the dollar world, think of the dollar universe, has expanded so much because, all these dollars that keep being printed in order to keep the factories of the rest of the world churning stuff out. The dollar sphere universe has expanded massively, right? But American manufacturing has contracted beyond imagination. And now we have all this dollar world corresponding to a very small degree of manufacturing. And that's the cause of their concern. They think that, and I think there's a logic to this. At some point, American manufacturing, the capacity to do stuff, to build stuff, will have shrunk to such an extent that at some point, especially when you have China and India and Brazil and other countries, the BRICS, expanding their manufacturing, well, for how long can the dollar universe ad infinitum, it cannot go ad infinitum expanding when essentially it's like a huge parasite being parasitic on an organism that is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking while the parasite is getting. So they fear that at some point there's going to be a sell-off of American dollars and the American hegemony is going to collapse overnight. Now, it's not an irrational fear. So what they want to do is they want to expand the manufacturing sphere of the United States and contract the dollar sphere in order to keep them in some proportion. And tariffs are just an instrument for it. Tariffs are not the point. Tariffs are the means, not the end, from their perspective. Now, Donald Trump may love tariffs and say that it's the most beautiful word in the American lexicon and so on. But if you read what Besant is saying, what Miran is saying, they're talking about dividing the dollar in order to expand American manufacturing and using the tariffs in order to force foreigners, those holders, big holders of large chunks of American dollars, to do as they're told with it, which is sell a lot of those dollars without buying Chinese currency, without buying euros, because they don't want to see an alternative currency picking up the slack and becoming a competitor to the American dollar globally. Now, if you look at it from that perspective, okay, then the discussion becomes far more interesting. What the Trump shock is attempting has a rational core, and we can then debate whether it's going to work or not, and what repercussions that is going to bring if it works, and what repercussions it's going to bring if it doesn't work. What we don't need is this hand-waving and panic-stricken mood in which the radical center finds itself.
If your goal is to keep American hegemony, it sounds actually quite rational.
It does. That's what scares me. What scares me is not that there is a madman in the White House who doesn't know what he's doing and he's going to blow up the world. What scares me is that this madman is going to succeed, like Nixon did. Mitch, Nixon was a madman. He was a very poor excuse for human nature. It's well documented that he was mentally unstable. We know that he truly loathed democracy and the rule of law. Why have we forgotten that? Behaving as if Trump is an aberration. He's not an aberration.
I mean, there's the madman theory, right? And that's what Nixon played into, that you don't know what he's capable of doing. And the idea was you try to use that for your advantage.
Indeed. So we can now discuss, if you want, whether that thing is going to work and what I think the repercussions are.
I do want to, and I do thank you for taking the time to outline kind of the rationale behind this, because I have found it difficult to grasp. Again, we are in conversation with Yanis Varoufakis, former finance minister of Greece, leader of Mira 25 Party, and professor of economics at the University of Athens. So, is what you are saying then, is this a continuation then of neoliberalism, or is this the end of neoliberalism?
I think it's the end of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism did its dirty work, and now it's being thrown out as a surplus to requirements, like globalization. What I think is happening is this. In the context of this attempt to shrink the dollar world and increase the manufacturing capacity of the United States, again, I'm not saying it's going to succeed, but in the context of this project, I don't think that this administration cares very much about China becoming a regional hegemonic power. They understand that those tariffs are not going to affect China. I mean, they will affect them, but they're not going to upend the Chinese model. China has a very well-established economy. It will be, if anything, it will benefit from what is happening, because the Chinese leadership will have to rebalance their own economy, increase aggregate demand domestically, try to absorb many of those net exports that used to go to the United States. They will try to absorb them locally, which means they will have to increase consumption locally. And I think that the Trumpists, the Trump team, are quite relaxed about that. They can see that the world is now going, instead of being one global village, capitalist village, it's going to become an archipelago of different jurisdictions, primarily the Chinese sphere of influence and the American sphere of influence. And I think that, Trump's administration is quite relaxed about that. If they can bring China down a little bit, that will make them very happy. But their intention is not regime change. That was the Clinton administration's attempt. They thought that through globalization and neoliberalism, that the Chinese Communist Party would have the same fate as the Soviet Communist Party, and they were proven completely wrong. But Trump doesn't have this kind of ambition. He's quite happy to dominate the Western Hemisphere, a U.S. Region around the world, a large region, maybe the largest, but nevertheless not the whole of the globe. There is also ample evidence that his strategy is going to succeed in shifting production lines from Europe and Japan and from Taiwan to the United States. So some jobs will be created. A lot more stuff will be produced in the United States. There's no doubt about that. I very much fear that manufacturing jobs will not be as much of a great success story. There will be some, but there won't be nearly enough to fulfill Trump's promises to the MAGA blue-collar base, electoral base. But there will be enough for him to claim to have reversed the trend of deindustrialization in the United States. A lot of these will be jobless factories. You only have to go just outside Austin, where Apple is manufacturing the MacBook Pro, to see that hardly any human being is employed. It's all automated. So this will be the realm of AI-driven robotic labor. And that's important in relation to your question about neoliberalism. Because if you read or listen to the stalwarts of big tech in the United States and Silicon Valley, people like Peter Thiel, Katz, and others, you will find that there is a new version of neoliberalism. I might call it technolordism or technoliberalism. It goes beyond the divinity of the market. You see, Mitch, the way I understood, as an economist and a politician and political animal, I was never impressed by neoliberalism, and I thought it was never particularly new, nor particularly liberal. It was not even philosophically coherent. It wasn't even interesting. It was just a hodgepodge of 19th century ideas brought together under the influence of Hayek and Friedman in order to justify what Nixon was doing. It's first Nixon decided to do what he did, and then they had to have an ideology and a political theory and an economic theory in order to, like every throne has a priest next to it, blessing it. So they needed the political philosophy and the economics that would bless what they were doing anyway. It was not that, suddenly they read Hayek or Friedman and they decided to change the world. No. First they wanted to do what they did, and then they found that Friedman and Hayek were saying things that were useful to them in explaining and propagating the ideas that were functional to whatever it is that they were doing in any case. So neoliberalism, if you look at it, what it does is this. It celebrates the market as a divinity. That was a major break from the free market ideology up until the 1970s, because the free market ideology up until the 1970s was Adam Smith. The idea that the market is a fantastic mechanism, a fantastic slave of humanity. You have the market like a machine. It's automatic. You don't need to manage it. You don't need to supervise it. Actually, it's best if you don't manage it and supervise it. You leave it to its own devices. And what it will do is it will synthesize, as if by an invisible hand moving behind our backs. Like, this is the allusion to the divine. It will synthesize our wants, our talents, our energies, our capital, our labor, our land, whatever, bring it all together, and suddenly you have prosperity for the most. So up until the 1970s, up until neoliberalism emerged, traditional Smithian liberalism was all about the market as a good slave of humanity. With neoliberalism, what you have is the celebration of the market as a divinity, as an end in itself. It became, something, we don't care whether it works or not. Remember 2008, the whole thing came tumbling down. And yet, neoliberalism had made the market seem like the objective, not the means to an objective, but the objective. So that, now, to put it differently, with the Nixon shock, the bankers became central in the distribution of income. Up until 1971, under the Bretton Woods system, the bankers were irrelevant. Banks were severely circumscribed in what they could and couldn't do. There was very little stuff they could do. They couldn't take your money and bet in the stock exchanges or derivatives markets. There were capital controls. A banker could not shift money from the United States to Brazil to Europe at will. They had to get a permission to do this from the Fed, from the IMF. So banking was boring up until this explosion that the Nixon shock triggered. That couldn't continue after the Nixon shock, because the whole point, as I said before, of the Nixon shock was to use the American trade deficit in order to absorb into the United States the goods of everyone. That's why you needed to have free trade, and to bring in the money, the foreign capitalist money through the bankers. But that meant unshackling the bankers, letting the bankers do as they pleased, go crazy. And you needed an ideology for that. So for the rise of financial capital, you needed an ideology to back it. And that ideology was neoliberalism. Today, if you look at this whole cabal around Donald Trump, it's the owners of what I call cloud capital, not financial capital. What lives in your phone. What I call cloud capital as a produced means, not of production, but of modifying people's behavior. Making you want things directly. This is what Amazon.com does. This is what TikTok, Facebook, Instagram do. They implant desires into your heart and then satisfy them immediately, bypassing all markets. So we have a new capital in town, which is cloud capital, which is taking over from financial capital. And that needs its own ideology. And that new ideology is what I call tech lordism or technoliberalism, which is doesn't put the individual or the market at its center. It puts the idea of this merger, this fusion of cloud capital and the human brain, and the human body and the human mind. That takes the form of these utterly mad theories about transhumanism, that we will never die. There's no need to die. We can upload our minds on the computer. That's the new ideology which I'm discerning, replacing neoliberalism in the same way that neoliberalism was needed as an ideology to unshackle financial capital. This tech lordism or technoliberalism is needed to unshackle Silicon Valley so that its fusion with our mind on behalf of those who control it, cloud capital and our mind, the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musk of the world, can be allowed to do its thing without any democratic controls.
Do you think then it makes perfect sense why at Donald Trump's inauguration there in attendance were Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, people whose companies previously were, denying Trump access to their platforms suddenly are now are they? Do you think these companies that these people represent are in favor of these tariffs?
No, they're not. But they are prepared to go along with them because what they care about is they care about the freedom of their cloud capital to fuse itself in everything, in every realm, including our own brains. Let me give you an example. Elon Musk, right? His motivation is conflicted. Because on the one hand, one of the first things that Trump did when he entered the White House with Elon Musk in tow was to do something that really damaged Tesla. He removed the subsidies of electric vehicle sales in the United States. That immediately was $8,000-9,000 off every Tesla. Right? And Elon Musk didn't like it, but didn't bat an eyelid. Because his mind, his eyes are focusing on the bigger game. And the bigger game is the capacity of Tesla in the long run to make a lot more money, not from so much the car or the spare parts that he sells, but from your data while you're driving a Tesla. This is why he bought Twitter. I remember when he was buying Twitter, all those idiotic analysis of why it was such a bad purchase. It cost $44 billion. It was nothing. He got it for a song. It was his way of fusing himself into cloud capital. He didn't have any cloud capital before. Now he does. He wants to bring together payments, mobility. He wants the greatest prize for Tesla will be deregulation of his autonomous driving systems. And he's quite happy to see losses that he's making as a result of the end of the subsidies, of the tariffs, because he can't import cars that he's making in China, import them to the United States. And by the way, when I saw that picture that you described so vividly of Trump, the emperor, with the big tech lords around him, New York Times, Washington Post, the Times of London and so were talking about, oh my God, look at that. He's got the tech lords around him. This is, you know what I thought? I thought, oh my God, this guy is having fun. That looked to me more like a Roman emperor returning from Egypt with the captured hegemons of Egypt, of North Africa, of Syracuse and so on, and putting them on display back in Rome. They were his captives, but they were voluntary captives because they know that they have something that is the ultimate source of power in this new era, which I call a technofeudal era. They have this cloud capital. So when Elon Musk with Doge storms into the IRS, into various departments of government, and he hardwires his own computers into the data sets of the Federal Reserve. Doesn't matter what he loses from the tariffs, what he loses from the end of the subsidies for sales of Tesla cars. He has what he really needs. That is the full expansion of his empire of cloud capital.
Into the federal government's database?
Yes, and not just. He's got Twitter for everything else. Now he has the public database as well. And when he gets the okay to create his own payment system, because that's what he ultimately wants, he wants to essentially, he wants to copy what the Chinese have done with an application called WeChat. Because the Chinese have an application that doesn't exist in your country, or in my country, or in Europe, in the West generally. WeChat can do everything that all the other apps we have does, but it can also do something that Wall Street would never allow in the West, and that is free payments, independently of where your bank account is, to anyone, independently of where their bank account is. The Chinese have that because they decided to have it, and damn their bankers. But Wall Street has always blocked. Oops, something happened and I lost my camera.
Well, we still have your audio. Oh, there you are.
I'm back. Sorry. Okay, I'll continue. I hope that didn't spoil your recording.
We're fine.
Yeah. So Wall Street would never allow this to happen because it doesn't want to share its financial profits or rents with Silicon Valley. And Musk has his eye on this. So these are the big techno-feudal games that these people are playing. Tariffs for them are just an inconvenience, short-term losses.
This cloud capital, and again, your previous book is called Technofeudalism. This cloud capital, is it, and I'm sure you'll take issue with this term, a natural progression of how our economy is going anyways? Into the digital sphere? Is there another way of going forward here from what's happening?
There's always another way. Anybody who tells you that there's no alternative is lying to you. The beauty of humanity is that we can always create alternatives. The question is, do we have the political structures in place so that as a species we can behave rationally rather than the way we are behaving now? And one of the greatest enemies of humanity is Tina, the absurd notion that there is no alternative. Of course, there's an alternative. Look, techno-feudalism for me is what happened when capital, because it was so triumphant, especially with the Nixon shock, became, well, actually mutated. It generated a new strand of capital, which I call cloud capital. You see, we had this discussion in another program of yours, and thank you for that. Let me just repeat the story that I tell on this. Capital has always been a produced means of production, whether it's a fishing rod or a plow or a steam engine or an industrial robot for that matter. It's a machine that you produce to build other stuff, a produced means of production. But the reason why I'm referring to cloud capital as a mutation is that what lives in your phone, in your computer, in your iPad, your tablet, in the optic fiber cables connecting all that stuff together with satellites, with server farms and algorithms and all that. Yeah, this is a networked capital, but it is not produced to produce something else. It's not a produced means of production. What it gives somebody like Peter Thiel of Palantir or to Jeff Bezos, Amazon, or to Google, or to Microsoft, or to Elon Musk through X, it gives them the power to manipulate your behavior, your desires and your behavior, and your thinking, and your talking, and your speaking. This is what it does. So it's a produced means of behavioral modification. That is a major mutation. It's still a machine, but it does something very different to what the machines that Henry Ford had in his factories to produce other machines, the Model T, were doing. Yeah? So this produces raw power to change your mind, to change your actions. That is beyond Brave New World. It's beyond 1984. It is at a level of dystopia that, Aldous Huxley and George Orwell had not imagined.
I feel like I feel this with the algorithm when I'm on social media sites. We all have vices, or at least I do, that I try to stay away from. But once after clicking on something that sort of feeds into that vice, I notice it comes up again and again and again in my feed, trying to tempt me to do it again.
But that's when it fails. The algorithm works best when you don't even notice it. When, for instance, you're on Amazon and it recommends a good book, a book which you actually buy and you read it and you think, my God, this is great. Then it wins your trust. I don't know about you, but when I listen to music on Spotify, what Spotify's algorithm recommends to me to listen to next, either I like it or I love it. There's no chance I will hate it. It knows me. It knows me better than my best friends. And then I don't realize that this is the algorithm that is actually doing things to me, because actually I enjoy what I'm doing. And it's not a hindrance. It's not like, an annoying ad, keep buying this thing which I don't want. No, it gives me something that I want and which I'm grateful for having. And that is when the algorithm is very successful. But to answer your question, okay, so what do we do? Well, the answer is not to switch off our phones and buy old Nokia phones that are not connected to the internet and, go and live into the jungle and go native. The answer is to socialize those machines. And that's why I've always been a left-winger in my life, because I always loved the products of capitalism. The steam engine was a magnificent machine. The electricity system, the fact that we can have light in the middle of the night is brilliant. AI, I adore AI. Especially the Chinese version, DeepSeek, I have to say, it's actually very good when it comes to, I used to study mathematics. I was a mathematician once upon a time, and because of my political endeavors, forgotten most of it. So when I have a spare moment, I ask it to do crazy things like, combine two different theorems, one by Leibniz, one by Gauss, and show me what it can be done with that. And it's brilliant. It was my life dream when I was young to have something like that. So these tools are fantastic, but in exactly the same way as the age of iron brought simultaneously to humanity, the age of iron, I'm talking about 1000 BC, it brought us remarkable new capacities, but also new weaponry that allowed us to kill each other with great ferocity and efficiency, like every technology. The question is, who owns it? Who controls it? So that's why I remain a socialist, a steadfast socialist. I believe in, not that the state should own it, but I believe that we should have companies on the basis of one employee, one share, one vote. And we should also have a bill of digital rights so that the data belongs to us. It doesn't belong to the 0.0001%. It's not even the 0.1% anymore. It's the 0.00001% of the technofeudal lords.
I think I heard you say in other interviews that you could also find online. You've been popping up a lot in my algorithm as well. Is Trump is forming what's happening right now is a new world order, a new global order. I guess an economic order is being formed. Has it been formed yet? Is it still to be determined where it goes?
Oh, it's still work in progress. We are now harking back again once more to the 1971 moment. We are now, let's say, Nixon's shock took place on the 15th of August 1971. We are around October of 1971, when everything was opaque. The dust had not settled. It took years before the dust settled, for that matter. It wasn't until 1980, 81, the Reagan era, when we saw the impact of the Nixon shock. Now, is the Trump shock going to be as successful shaping this new world as Nixon shock? I don't know. It's not. It will depend on a number of things. Firstly, on the longevity of the shock, of the project. Because remember before I mentioned Volcker, who was a member of the team in the Nixon administration in 1970, 71, 72, 73. Then you have Carter getting elected, a very different species of president, much nicer person than his predecessors. And yet, what Carter does is he takes Volcker, who was part of that team that was behind the Nixon shock, and appoints him to the Fed. And then the Volcker shock is the continuation. It is the implementation, the final chapter in the implementation of the Nixon shock, with massive increases in interest rates. So the flow of capital into the United States accelerates at a pace which was necessary to complete the Nixon shock. So is the next administration after Trump going to have somebody like Carter in the presidency who will appoint somebody that is part of the planning of the Trump shock? Who knows? There are other questions too. How will the rest of the world react? So you have Europe now, 500 million people, very rich, very cultivated, technologically quite advanced, not as advanced as the United States or China, but quite advanced, with a huge market and a lot of money. And then you have China, which has been through an unprecedented developmental spurt over the last 30 years. Now, here's one scenario that would not be good for the for the chances of the Trump shock. How about the possibility that Europe realizes that it's been a vassal of the United States for too long without any good effects for Europe, and they, instead of doing as they're told by Washington and continue the tariff war with China, or participating on Washington's side in the new Cold War against China, imagine the European leaders having the nous to tell Beijing it's time to collaborate. And instead of fighting each other through tariffs between the European Union and China, to have a trade deal between us, and also combine the forces of the European Central Bank and the Central Bank of China to stimulate the European and the Chinese economies. Now that would be a game changer, and that would blunt the Trump shock. But I very much fear, Mitch, as I'm saying that, I'm losing the will to live, because I know my European colleagues here, and they're incapable of doing that. And you can see that they are running around like decapitated chickens, panicking, fighting with one another, and betting the house on continuing the Ukraine war and building more tanks in German factories, which is a pathetic way of responding to the Trump shock.
Do you think this results in a higher concentration of wealth at the top?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It always does. When the ruling classes execute a plan to improve their capacity to reproduce themselves, while the working class, the middle classes, have zero representation anywhere. Inequality always gets bolstered, always grows. This is the whole point about democracy. Democracy is not something nice to have on the side. It is not a luxury. If you don't have democracy, if the demos is not an agent, it's not part of the decision-making process. And that the whole neoliberal era has been all about taking the demos out of democracy. Then you have enhancing inequality, and not only in income and wealth, but also in decision-making powers. And the result is a deeper economic crisis for the whole, while the top may be in a state of panic within their gated communities. They experience more and more wealth concentration.
Yanis Varoufakis, again, is former finance minister of Greece, leader of the Mera 25 party, and professor of economics at the University of Athens. He is the author of the book Technofeudalism. Yanis Varoufakis, that was very helpful in trying to understand this whole, I guess, I won't restart the conversation of whether or not this is a trade war, but this has been helpful in understanding kind of what's at play here. And so I thank you.
The pleasure, again, is all mine.